It was the evening of Tuesday, January 12th, in the year 1744. By 6 o'clock the grey of afternoon had deepened to the blackness of night, and a heavy rain began to fall, so that the Sèvres road, a mile beyond the Paris barrier, was shortly thick with mud. The only light here visible came from the window of a wretched tavern at the wayside, and by this mine host, had he been watching, would have had some difficulty in perceiving the two riders who came to an uncertain halt by his door. It is late, Duplessis, and we have still 3 miles to go. More than that, 'tis the worst cabaret in France. And you would be no more of a Jean-Jacques than necessary tonight, Claude, returned the other good-humoredly. I should prefer drowning or to perish of a room by the way than be poisoned by the liquor to be had here, returned the other, flicking his saddle restlessly with his riding-whip. So be it, then. Come, we waste time. Morty! A little gently there, I beseech. It is raining mud. A dig of the spur in the thoroughbred's flank, a spattering of drops from the puddle in which they had stood, a quick apology, and the landlord had lost his guests, illustrious guests, who paid never a sou too much for their wine, but could make a drinking place the fashion for weeks by 5 minutes' presence within it. The two rode for some minutes in silence, though no one of the finest apperception could have felt any enmity existent between them. The night lowered. The rain pelted coldly from the starless sky, and horses and riders alike shrank from the raw, streaming atmosphere. When the silence was again broken, the lights of Paris were visible in the distance. This time it seemed that Duplessis, the Duc de Richelieu, addressed his companion's secret thoughts as though he had been reading them for some time past. Believe me, Claude, you are unwise. She is not quite of your fibre. The elder branch, you will often find, if you study these things, is less quick in sensibility, though perhaps not lacking in finesse. The king, dear child, the king. The king is a man. I also am one, he, de Bourbon, I, de Mailly. Richelieu laughed heartily. Pretty, Claude. I must enter it in the unauthenticated register at Madame Doublet's tomorrow. Why do you not lay the matter thus before Madame de Châteauroux herself? Ah, monsieur, I think you understand her even less than I. I do not dare address her as my position admits. My cousin cannot be more proud of our family than am I, and yet. In the darkness Louis Armand François Duplessis de Fronsac de Richelieu, from strong force of habit, snapped his fingers. Afraid of a woman. Truly, we have schooled you well, Claude. You, Monsieur le Duc, you yourself, have you kissed my cousin on the lips? Oh, I do not infringe on His Majesty's rights. Mon Dieu! If it were any but you. Come, my dear Count, you are making an enormous mistake, permit me to say. The one thing which no man should ever do is to take himself in great seriousness. You have yet many a lesson to learn about women. Now hear from me a bit of gravity, which shall prove my friendship for all of you, madam, yourself, and His Majesty. When it happens that a man chooses a woman, and the woman accepts that man, whether it be for love, or something else, it is the place of the world merely to look on. A third personality will not enter complacently into the tête-à-tête. The king heaps upon his duchess the favors which only a royal lover can confer. And madame certainly does not seem loath to accept them. A dozen besides yourself are sighing after her today. Yet remember D'Agenois, my friend. And an MLLE d'Angeville is charming in L'École de Femmes. De Richelieu smiled slightly, fumbled for his snuff-box, which was unobtainable at the moment, and never knew that Claude had angrily squared his shoulders and was cruelly hurting his horse with bit and spur. The mention of D'Angeville happily turned the subject, as the Duke had intended it to do, and by the time the barrier was reached the vicissitudes of the Count de Mailly and the position of Madame de Châteauroux were, to all appearances, forgotten. Once in the city, with rivers of rain above and below, and filth, crime, poverty, and utter darkness about them, Claude de Mailly and his illustrious companion made their way with what rapidity they could down the Rue de Sèvres, past St. Vincent Delaware Paul and the Lazarist, through the little Rue Mi-Carême, the Place du Dragon, Rue Dauphine, and so out upon the quays. After riding for 3 squares along the river bank, with the waters of the Seine foaming below them, the two finally passed the Pont St. Louis, and, turning down a short side street, drew up before a doorway wherein lanterns were lighted, and before which 2 link boys and twice as many lackeys stood waiting. Above, upon a long iron arm, tossed by the ever-rising wind, swung a great painted sign, a harlequin in cap and bells, throwing his party-colored cap above his head. Below, in uncertain letters, were the words Café Procope. As the 2 gentlemen dismounted, Richelieu called to one of the servants, who hastened forward to take his bridle. A second assisted Claude, while another, evidently under orders, turned and called back to someone inside. Instantly both doors were flung wide open, while the landlord of this most popular resort himself braved the weather and came out, candelabrum in hand, to greet his guests. "Ah, Cresson," deigned the Duke, nodding, as he entered the house, "are the rest not yet arrived?" "Indeed, my lord, they have waited for some time above at Monsieur le Duc de Gevres, Monsieur le Duc d'Epernon, the Marquis de Mailly and the Baron de Halbach." "'Twas the hunt kept us. Light the way up." Claude lagged behind to throw off his wet riding cloak, brush what water he could from his hat, and shake out his hair which had flattened beneath the protecting collar. Richelieu was kept waiting for some seconds, and the landlord had become ill at ease before the young precious signified his willingness to proceed to the room above, where his host waited. Not a bad-looking fellow was Claude de Mailly, albeit what individuality he possessed had some difficulty in asserting itself through the immaculate foppishness of his attire. His wig, a very fine one, was arranged à la brigadier, and tied with the regulation black ribbon. His forehead was broad and smooth, his eyes of a grayish-green, shaded with heavy black lashes and good brows, which, however, were artificially penciled. His nose was one bequeathed of 10 generations of noble ancestry, his mouth was sensitive, his complexion dark. The dress that he wore was not expensive, though its ruffles were of fine Mechlin, and he carried both patch and snuff-box of ivory and gold. Richelieu, who preceded him up the narrow stairs, was a more striking figure, taller, broader of frame, with well-shaped head, great brown eyes that had carried him through life, a hand like a woman's, with muscles of steel, a smile that had won him a king's heart, and a charm, a power of presence which had made time stand still before him, so that his 48 years were something less than Claude de Mailly's 23. Before the 2 noblemen and the landlord were halfway upstairs, there reached them from above the tones of familiar voices engaged in that species of conversation, half witty, half absurd, which typified the times. "Parbleu, Baron, you will be calling Richelieu out tomorrow. Your carp will be ruined. In such case, Marquis, I must order your cousin spitted. He will have been swimming the streets long enough, by the time he arrives, to have acquired an excellent flavor, of a kind. Oh, 'tis more likely that the Count de Mailly's flavor would be rather cloying. All love is sweet, but his is so really violent, gentlemen, that for a month after you would sicken with the mere thought of a risole," cried the Duke from the threshold. "And the epitaph which you would place over my picked bones," said Claude, from behind Richelieu's shoulder, "would be Sacher, meme, etant dans Camille, sa nature était aussi belle. Il entre dans la vie réelle." Bravo! Claude. We will forgive the lost feet. You have purchased pardon, cried de Halbach, smiling. He and de Mailly, Claude's cousin, and the brother of Madame de Châteauroux, went forward to greet the late comers. D'Halbach, Epicurean philosopher, and host of the small company, gave them a genial welcome. The Marquis grasped his cousin's hands, and bowed familiarly to the Duke, while the other 2 men in the room, d'Epernon and de Gesvres, boon companions, both intimates of the king, the one an amateur physician, the other an adept at embroidery, remained languidly seated, deigning a nod and smile to the last arrivals. After a few further words of greeting and explanation, the party of 6 arranged themselves about the oval table, on which were already placed the hors d'oeuvre and sweet wines, while Cresson hurried away towards his kitchens to command the attendance of 2 waiters and the first course of the supper. Only part of the evening's entertainment was being given by the Baron de Halbach. M. de Gesvres had arranged an amusement for the night which promised some novelty even to these utterly blasé gentlemen. He proposed conducting his friends across the river to his hotel, which, by royal permission, had, very conveniently for his pocket, been turned into a public gambling house. Its redoubtable owner, when not at Versailles, lived in exquisite style in his chateau at Saint-Ouen, and, since there was always a place for him in the Tuileries, the Hotel Richelieu, or, more covertly, the Hotel de Sèvres, in Paris, he had not yet felt any poignant discomfort through the loss of his ancestral house. On the contrary, the unique pleasure of appearing in its familiar rooms furnished with the rows of tables, frequented by bourgeois dwellers in Saint-Antoine, with the presence of an occasional petty noble, was really very refreshing to the jaded spirit of this vaporish child of highest France. It was a particularly select little company who gathered about the table in the private salon of the Café Procope on this stormy night. All of them were of the bluest of blood, all of them spent the greater part of their time about the person of the king. To all, the doors of any and every house or salon in Paris were open at any hour, and not one of them but had had hearts flung at him from the night of his first appearance in the Gallery of Mirrors to the present moment, when interest in the hors d'oeuvre was beginning to wane, and the first course of the supper should have been making its appearance. D'Epernon had commenced to bore them all with some remarks upon the recent bloodletting of His Majesty after a rout at Choisy, when Claude jumped unceremoniously from the table, crossed the room to a mirror, and took out his patchbox. "Trust you'll have no women tonight, de Gesvres," he remarked, breaking in upon d'Epernon. "I am wet through. My wig is in strings, and the powder has melted away like snow in June. While my boots," taking out a large star and pasting it below the corner of his left eye, "my boots will not be fit for my valet, when we return tonight. Claude is standing there, my lords, aching with vanity to have me relate to you how crazily he has borne himself today. Seal! 'Twould be driving me mad with anxiety to learn how soon I should be registering my presence at the Bastille, had I shown myself so little of a courtier, so utterly reckless for the sake of Madame's admiration as has he." Before anyone had time to voice his curiosity, Claude turned quickly from the mirror. "The Bastille, Richelieu. The Bastille. Surely." "Why not, my child? I have been there thrice for less, and the last time, had it not been for my ever-honored Duchess of Modena, I had been carried out shorter by a head than when I went in." The 5 gentlemen smiled broadly at certain memories still occasionally recalled on a rainy day at Versailles. But Henri, Claude's cousin, looked anxious. "What is your last exploit, Claude? Marie has been inciting you to rashness again?" Claude laughed. "Madame did not honor me by a single command. I rode a course, I shot a stag, and I won this, which was intended for a king, not me." Forthwith the young fellow drew from beneath his waistcoat something which even de Gesvres leaned forward to see. It was a glove, a white gauntlet, weighted on the back with a crest heavily embroidered in gold, and set here and there with tiny sapphires of the color lately known as œil du roi, while upon the smooth leather palm was painted a very good miniature of His Gracious Majesty, Louis XV. The little group of courtiers glanced from the trophy to the face of its owner, who was gazing upon them with a smile not wholly unconscious, but wisely tempered with cynicism. Presently the Baron reached forward and took the costly article from Claude. Holding it with a delicate touch in the light of a waxen candle, he smiled as he observed, "Madame should not have removed this ere she gave it to you, my dear Count." "I would to God she had not," cried de Mélinesle. For pairs of brows went gently up, but Claude's eyes met those of his cousin with such an expression of affection and melancholy that for an instant he seemed to be transformed to some other order of man. The slight pause was broken by the entrance of the first course proper of the supper. The Count took back his gage and thrust it again to the conventional resting place over his heart, and while the innumerable dishes were being placed upon the table or passed about, he returned the patchbox to his pocket and seated himself between his cousin and Richelieu. "Now that Claude has given you his meager idea of the crisis through which he passed today," remarked Claude's companion, helping himself to a fillet of partridge, "permit me to advance to him my own opinion of the affair, as well as to lay the tale before you all. His coming fate shall be surmised by you. Now hark, His Majesty and a little suite rode to Rambouillet yesterday, in the afternoon. The hunters were to follow this morning, but they say that de Rosset never permits the king to rise earlier than 8 o'clock, so that he is fain to be near the forest on the day of the chase. I was with him, but, for some royal reason, Madame la Duchesse, despite some very eloquent pleading on my part, had refused to go. Possibly Madame de Toulouse is of family too scrupulous to receive her." The Dukes and d'Holbach smiled. Claude, however, was of the royal train, for, mark you, gentlemen, Louis adores the Count at 20 miles distance from Madame his cousin. Well, then, at 10 this morning the meet was called at the edge of the forest. His Majesty was in a frenzy of eagerness, and did he not look like a little god, my dear Count? Hein? But for the point. The first deer had not yet been started by the keepers when a diversion occurred. His Majesty was talking with the headman. There was a murmur behind us. I turned about, and saw. The Count of Toulouse was a legitimated son of Louis XIV. Monsieur le Comte perishing of loneliness, murmured de Gevres, feebly. Not at all. On the contrary. It was Monsieur le Comte dismounted, standing beside the newly arrived coach of Madame de Châteauroux, with his head so very far inside the window that it set some of us thinking many things. Parbleu! I would that you had seen Louis's face. Madame must have risen very early, remarked d'Epernon, helping himself to a cream. Madame is always wonderful. When she stepped from the conveyance to greet her liege, she looked more of a queen than Her Majesty ever did. Small wonder that the king was all devotion. Before he had finished his first compliment, the heartless Leroy came forward to announce that stags do not wait. Madame was very gracious, and instantly mounted the horse prepared for her. She had driven from Versailles in her crimson habit. When all was ready, the king turned in his saddle and cried out before us, "What reward have you to offer, madam, to him who shall present you with the antlers today?" We all watched her. She smiled charmingly for an instant. Some turned their eyes then upon the king. I was more subtle. I gazed at Claude. "He is certainly very pleasant to look upon," observed d'Holbach, absently. "'Twas not his beauty, Baron. I am most tender of his modesty. But, next time I plead with MLLE Mercier for life and hope, I shall imitate the look he wore at that moment. Take care, my dear Richelieu. She will marry you if you do." "On my faith, that would not be bad. 'Tis an excellent way to rid oneself of a woman. Baron, the carp is marvelous." Madame, of course, offered the glove that you have seen as gage of triumph. It is worth 80 livres. Lesage himself did the miniatures. When we finally set off, Louis's eyes were bright with certainty of success, for who would dare to engage in rivalry with the king? Come, Duplessis, finish the tale. You are straining the budding nonchalance of Desmailly here to an alarming degree. Richelieu shrugged. We started, Madame following at a little distance, though half a dozen ladies rode. After a quarter of an hour we got sight of the animal, and de Savre fired at it, but missed. By the manner in which His Majesty sat his horse, as we raced along to gain on the beast, we all knew that our shots must go astray today. Gradually the king drew away from the rest of us, and we reined the horses a little. That is, all but one of us played good courtier. The one was Claude. Monsieur, you might dare Satan for a lady if you would, but no one should dare the king. Dare the king he did. In 5 minutes all of us were far enough behind to watch, while they two de Mailly and de Bourbon, gentlemen, were neck and neck among the hounds. Presently the Count fired, and missed. I hoped that it was purpose, for he did not reload. Then the stag ran through a little clearing, so that for 50 yards it was a perfect mark. Louis fired, of course, but the game kept on. I saw the king throw back his head with his gesture of anger. Then de Mailly, oh! How couldst thou, Claude, drew a pistol from his holster and fired. That bullet was made for death. I never saw a prettier shot. It went straight into the deer's neck. Another 5 yards. The animal wavered. The king was reloading his weapon. Claude was like lightning with his hands. Before His Majesty's gun was ready the pistol sounded again, and the beast fell. Good heaven, Claude! You have done badly, cried Henri, leaning over the table. His words were echoed by the rest. But His Majesty permitted you the trophy, drawled D'Epernon, unguardedly. Permitted, my lord, exclaimed the young man, haughtily, the gauntlet was not His Majesty's to give. Richelieu laughed. 'Twas a comedy, gentlemen, but a dangerous one. Louis was suavely furious, Madame annoyed and alarmed, but as indifferent as any coquette should be. Claude was charmingly humble and amorous. It was I who obtained permission for him and for myself to retire after luncheon. Certainly, Louis seemed entirely willing to grant it. So together we returned to Versailles, dressed, and came on here. And oh! I had forgot to mention it, but 'twas a marked fact that when Madame presented her left gauntlet to her cousin, the January skies instantly began to weep. Now, a question, was it from sympathy with the king, or dread for the Count de Mailly? Fear for the Count, du Plessis. The king needs small sympathy. Possibly thou art right, Baron. Who so happy as the king? What does he lack? He is a king, he has France for his purse, he is as handsome as the queen is ugly, and the most stately woman in Europe inhabits the little apartments. What more could he wish for? Claude bit his lip and his eyes sparkled with anger. M. de Mailly, you do not eat. I have finished, Baron. So ho! I did well not to have a second course, then. Now, gentlemen, the toasts. M. de Mailly Nesle, I propose your marquise. Not his wife, de Holbach. You mistake, Monsieur le Duc. I speak of Madame de Coigny. Ah! With pleasure. She is a most piquant madcap. Henri flushed. The lady whom he deeply and sincerely loved was a far tenderer subject with him than his reckless and heartless companions dreamed of or could have understood. But he drank the toast without comment, and was relieved to find that the conversation was straying from her as well as from his cousin's affair. Claude, perhaps, was not so well pleased. He was too young a lover, and too much in love, to rejoice that other women were being brought up for discussion, and he was too heedless of the delicacy of his position to care to contemplate its different aspects while the others talked. For, as to the matter of royal disfavor, it disturbed him not in the least, rather he looked upon the prospect of it as something which should redound to his credit in the eyes of her who at present constituted the single motive of his life. For the next 20 minutes, then, he sat over his wine, drinking all the toasts, and joining in the conversation when Madame de Lorigues, another sister of Henry's, was mentioned. But the interest had gone out of his eyes. Richelieu marked him silently. D'Holbach smiled with kindly humor on perceiving his preoccupation, and his cousin the Marquis read his mood with regret. Henri de Mélinesle had long since given up any hope of control over his sister, the favorite, and, through a lifelong companionship, Claude had been to him closer than a brother. Thus, whatever interest he felt in the latest developments of the Count's rash rivalry with the king, was all on behalf of the weaker side, that of his friend. The 6 gentlemen had not been more than 20 minutes over their wine when de Gesvres finally rose from his chair, and, as host for the remainder of the night, made suggestion of departure. "How shall we cross to my hotel? It rains too heavily for riding. Shall we go by chair?" "By chair, monsieur. Pardieu! I had thought we were citizens tonight. Let us walk." "My dear Baron," expostulated d'Epernon, "my surtout would not stand it, I swear to you." "A murrain on your surtout," retorted Richelieu. "Baron, I accompany you on foot." "And I also," added Claude. "I wish to ruin my boots completely. I have given Rochard too many things of late." "A bad idea, Count. Pay your servants, and they leave you at once. It is such a bourgeois thing to do." "We walk, then?" inquired d'Epernon. "I am sure we must be going to do so when M. de Gesvres addresses M. de Mailly upon the care of servants. Monsieur le Marquis, your servant." Richelieu and the Baron were already at the door. D'Epernon and Henri followed. There was nothing for it but for the third Duke to accept the companionship of the Count, and prepare to ruin his surtout also. As the small party passed out of the door of the café, Richelieu called over his shoulder, "Your horse is here, Claude. I had mine sent to my hotel. Surely you will not attempt to ride back to Versailles tonight. Will you lodge with me?" "Thank you, but Henri will house me, I think, will you not, cousin?" "Certainly, Claude. Madame will scarcely have anyone in my wing tonight, I think, though I confess that I have not been there for a week." "A bad idea," muttered Richelieu to the Baron. "I kept my ladies in better training when I had them." It was 15 minutes' rapid walk from the Procope to the Hotel de Gesvres. From the Quai des Tournelles the 6 proceeded to the Pont Saint-Michel, over the river, across the island, and to the new city by the Pont au Change, at the east end of which, near the Place du Chat, stood the most recent and most noted gambling house in Paris. 3 or 4 lanterns, shining dimly through the dripping night, lighted the doorways, which were open to the weather. Richelieu, d'Holbach, d'Epernon, and Henri entered together, with Claude and de Gesvres close behind. It was Richelieu who accosted the manager of the house in the entresol, for the owner of the place was not desirous of recognition. M. Basquinet, discerning that the newcomers were of rank, in spite of the fact that they came on foot, at once offered a private room. "The devil, good cit, d'ye take us for a pack of farmers, General? By my marrow, I've scarcely livres enough to grease the dice cup, let alone paying your nobility prices for new wine and bad rum. Private room, ha! Excellent, you tax collector, excellent, excellent." So spake Richelieu, in his favorite Bedaude, with a tone that no dweller in the Court of Miracles could have bettered for its purpose. The little party smiled covertly at sight of the landlord's crestfallen air, and then the other 5 followed their new plebeian leader up the broad ancestral staircase, leaving behind the steady murmur of voices and the chink of coin which had reached their ears from the chance machine rooms on either side of the hallway. On the second floor were the public rooms for play games, on the third, private apartments for such as chose to make a retreat of the place. And, in truth, many a well-known quarrel had fomented, and many a desperate duel already been fought, in those chambers, which of old had sheltered the royal and noble guests of the family de Gevres. The dice-room, the destination of Monsieur le Duc's present distinguished company, was very large, having once been the grand salon of the house. It was well filled by this hour, thick with smoke, heavy-aired with the fumes of mulled wine, and alive with the clack of the implements of the game and the subdued murmur of exclamations and utterances. The 6 gentlemen made their way to a table in the far corner of the room from which the door was invisible, and, seating themselves, they called at once for the cups, English pipes, and English rum. "By all means, rum," nodded the Baron de Halbach. "What other beverage would harmonize with this scene? We are surrounded by those a step lower than the bourgeoisie. For the time we also are lower than the bourgeoisie. And by tomorrow we shall have still stronger means of appreciation," retorted d'Epernon, "for our heads will feel as those of the bourgeoisie never did." The rum was brought, however, together with dice, and those long-stem clay pipes of which one broke 3 or 4 of an evening, and but rarely drew more than one mouthful of smoke from a light. Still imitating the manners of those about them, each 2 gentlemen played with a single cup, thus doing away with any possibility of loaded dice. Unlike the common people, however, they used no money on the table, perhaps for the simplest of reasons, that they had no money to use. Poor as a nobleman, rich as a bourgeois, was a common enough expression at that day, and as true as such sayings generally are. How debts of honor were paid at Versailles none but those concerned ever knew. But paid they always were, and that within the time agreed upon, and there was no newly invented extravagance, no fresh and useless method of expenditure for baubles or jeweled garments, that every courtier did not feel it a duty as well as pleasure to indulge at once. For the last 25 years there had been, as for the next 5 there would be, a continually increasing costliness in the mode of court life, and a consequent diminution in court incomes, until the end of all things for France's highest and best, should come with merciful, swift fury. Each member of the party, this evening, played with him in whose company he had walked from the Café, de Gevres and the Count, Richelieu and de Halbach, d'Epernon and Mélinesel. The 3 games were in marked contrast to those carried on about them. Not a word relative to losses or winnings was spoken. The stakes were agreed upon almost in whispers, the cubes were rattled and thrown once, then again from the other side. The differences were noted mentally. Winner and loser sipped their rum, drew out a pipe, and made a new stake. Sometimes 10 minutes would be spent in watching the noisy eagerness of men at a neighboring table, for that was the chief object in their coming tonight. The great hall was filled with those of an essentially low order. Coarse faces, coarse manners, coarse garments, and corsos abounded there, though now and again might be found a velvet coat, a lace ruffle, and a manner badly aped from the supposed elegancies of the court. A strange and motley throng gathered from all Paris wherever this common vice held men in its grip. Here those from the criminal quarters, from the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, from the streets of petty shopkeepers and tradesmen, from the little bourgeoisie, came to mingle together, indiscriminately, equalized, rendered careless of the origin of companions by their common love of the dice. Here were men of all ages, from the fierce stripling who regarded a franc as a fortune, to the senile creature, glued to his chair, the cubes rattling continually in his trembling cup, and the varying luck of the evening his life and death. All the pettiness and some of the nobility to be found in mankind were portrayed here, could those who had come to study have read aright. D'Holbach, the philosopher, doubtless did so, for men had been his mental food for many years. Nevertheless he said nothing to Richelieu of what he discovered, but took snuff when he lost, and puffed at his pipe when he won, and cogitated alone among those whom he knew so well. Time drew on apace and the evening was passing. There were few arrivals now, the rooms were filled, and it was too early for departure. M. de Gevres wished, possibly, that the hours would hurry a little, for he was losing heavily to Claude. Nevertheless he gave no sign of discomfort, and even interrupted the Count's purposeful pauses to continue the game. Just as de Mailly shook for a stake of 500 livres, 2 people, gentlemen by dress, entered the room. Claude threw high. The Duke, with an inward exclamation of anger, gently received the cup. He shook with perfect nonchalance, and finally dropped the ivory squares delicately before him. "Bravo, M. de Gevres, you have thrown well." The Duke started to his feet. His example was speedily followed by the rest of the party, who, after bowing with great respect, stood looking in amazement at the newcomer. His companion, who was bareheaded, remained a little behind, grinning good-naturedly at the gamesters. Richelieu spoke first. "Indeed, your mage." "Pardon, Duplessis, the Chevalier Melot." "Your pardon, sire. You take us by surprise. Has anyone suffered from the shock?" Sire, I think, since your coming has turned my luck," remarked Claude, with the double meaning in his words perfectly apparent to everyone there. Yes, I had thought M. de Gevres must win with 11. Come, gentlemen, add 2 to your party, and forget, for the evening, even as he will do, the unimpeachable propriety of M. de Barrier. Asterisk. Asterisk, the chief of police, and a favorite companion of the king. De Barrier laughed, and drew 2 more chairs to the table. "Do not stand," continued the king. "I am merely chevalier tonight." Louis seated himself beside Richelieu, with whom he evinced a desire to speak privately. D'Holbach, perceiving this, began at once, with his usual tact, to entertain the rest of the company by an anecdote concerning D'Alembert and Voltaire. Immediately the king turned to his favorite courtier. "D'Amélie came straight to Paris with you today?" "We rode to Versailles first, sire, changed our clothes there, and came hither immediately." "And now the truth, Richelieu. I will brook nothing less. He did not see Madame after he left the hunt?" The Duke opened his eyes. "We left Madame de Châteauroux with you. We have not seen her since." The king drew a deep breath. "She left the hunting party half an hour after you, knowing that it was not in my power to follow her. I feared it was to join him. I have left everything to make sure of his whereabouts. The fellow drives me mad." While Louis spoke, a gleam came into the Duke's eyes. He smiled slightly, and said, with a nod towards de Barrier, and that daring which was permitted to him alone, "Your Majesty brought a lettre de cachet in someone else's pocket?" Louis looked slightly nonplussed. He shrugged, however, as he answered, "No lettre de cachet will be used." Then, as the laughter from the Baron's tale subsided, the king addressed the party, "We will not stop your game, my friends. In fact, I will myself play one of you." "And which of us is to be so honored, Chevalier?" inquired d'Epernon. "It is a difficult choice, I confess. However, choice must be. Monsieur le Comte, will you try 3 turns with me?" There was a little round of glances as Claude bowed, murmuring appreciation of the honor. "The dice, then," cried the king. "Richelieu, your cup. We will play with but 1. "And he who throws twice best shall win," repeated the Duke. "Yes." "What are the stakes?" inquired the Baron, gently. Claude's heart sank, while his cousin dared not allow his sympathy to appear. It was frequently ruinous work, this gaming with a king, and the revenues of the younger branch of the house of D'Amélie were not great. "The stakes," returned Louis, with a long glance at his opponent, "shall be, on my side." He threw back his cloak, unbuttoned a plain surtout, and from his ruffles unfastened a diamond star of great value. He placed it upon the table. There was a little, regular murmur of conventional admiration. Claude bit his lip thoughtfully. "And mine?" he asked, looking squarely at the king. Louis coughed and waved one hand, with a gesture of deprecation at the question. "Yours should not be so large. We play to the goddess of chance. You won, today, a certain gauntlet of white leather, a simple thing, but it will do. I will play this for that. You see the odds are favorable to you." Claude flushed scarlet, and not a man at the table moved. "The gauntlet was a gage, sire." "We play for it," was the reply. The Count glanced round the circle, noting each face in turn. Baron de Halbach was engaged with snuff. The other faces, excepting only de Barrier's, were blank. But Richelieu's eyes met those of Claude, and the head of the king's favorite gentleman shook, ever so slightly, at the rebellion in the Count's face. Then, very slowly, de Mailly unfastened his coat and drew from its place the glove of Madame de Châteauroux. He laid it on the table beside the star. "We play," cried His Majesty, smiling as he seized the leathern cup. He shook well, and dropped the dice vigorously before him. 7, cried the company. It was 4 and 3. Claude received the implements from the king's hands, tossed and threw. 8, was the return. It was 3 and 5. The king bit his lip, and hastily played again. The cube stared up at him impudently. On one was a 3, on the other a 1. None spoke, for Louis frowned. Claude was very sober but very composed as he tried his second chance. It seemed that he could not but win. The courtiers hung quietly on the play. When the cup was lifted from the dice, there was a series of exclamations. Claude himself laughed a little, and the king drew a long sigh of relief. 2 and 1 had de Mailly thrown. It was Henri who voiced the general interest. "You are even," he said, quietly. The king suddenly rose to his feet. "Not for long," he exclaimed. For some seconds he rattled the dice in the box, not attempting to conceal his palpable nervousness. When the black spots which lay uppermost were finally counted, a smile broke over the royal lips. 10 points he had made this time. De Mailly, who had also risen, looked at them for a second with compressed lips, but did not hesitate in his throw. Like de Gevres, he dropped the squares before him with pointed delicacy. Then he stepped quietly back, with a throb at his heart, but no change in his face. Not a courtier spoke. "We will play again," cried the king, loudly, for they were, indeed, no longer even. M. de Mailly had thrown 6 and 6. De Mailly had thrown 6 and 6. De Mailly had thrown 6 and 6. "Pardon, your Majesty," said Claude, in reply to the king's voiced desire. "I could not play again against France and hope to win, though by but a single point. Therefore I beg that you will spare my humiliation, and accept the gauntlet as proof of your gracious forgiveness of my daring." At this Richelieu looked open-faced approval upon the Count, and de Gevres and d'Epernon, who had been roused from their ordinary state of ennui by the pretty comedy played before them, glanced at each other with appreciation of so excellent an act of courtiership. "Monsieur le Comte, if I accept your generosity, it must only be on condition that, as gage of my esteem for you, and our mutual goodwill, you wear this star. Permit me to fasten it upon your coat." The small ceremony over, and the light of royal favor glittering in the candle rays over the Count de Mailly's heart, His Majesty, with tender touch, took up the coveted gauntlet, put it inside his embroidered waistcoat, and, placing his hand on de Barrier's shoulder, bowed a good night to the party in the Hotel de Gevres. Immediately after the king left, the other participant in the struggle for a woman's gage also rose. Claude was tired. He had no mind to be assailed with the volley of epigrams, bons mots, and various comments that he knew would soon begin to be discharged from the brains of his companions. Certainly, he should have considered the episode a happy one. Already, since that talk of esteem and goodwill from the king, he could feel the change in attitude assumed towards him by de Gevres and d'Epernon. But the sight of these figures wearied him now, and he suddenly longed for a solitude in which to face his rapidly growing regret that his cousin's glove had passed out of his possession. "What, monsieur," cried de Gevres, when he rose, "you will not give me the chance to retrieve myself tonight?" "Small hope for you with such luck as the Count's," returned de Holbach. "When a man wins 2 points off a king, by how much may he defeat a duke?" Reply, Richelieu. "It is geometry." Richelieu laughed. "I congratulate you, Monsieur le Comte," he said. De Mailly bowed. Then, turning to the Marquis, he held out his hand. "Will you come, Henri, or must I beg shelter of Madame la Marquise alone?" "I come, Claude. Good night, and thanks for a most charming evening, and a comedy worthy of Granvelle, Messrs." "Thank thy sister for that," returned de Gevres. Claude made a general salute, and then, without further parley, accompanied his friend from the room and the house. "My horse is still at the Procope," observed Claude at the door. "No, I ordered it sent to my hotel before we left the café." "We walk, then?" "I am afraid so. I did not think to order my coach, and not a chair will be obtainable on such a night." "It is as well. The exercise will be a relief." They started at a good pace up the long, wide thoroughfare that bordered the river, and walked for some minutes in a silence that was replete with sympathy. It was some distance from the gambling house to the Hôtel de Mailly, Henry's abode, which was situated on the west bank of the Seine, on the Quai des Theatins, just opposite the Tuileries, on the Pont Royal. The wind was coming sharply from the east, bringing with it great, pelting raindrops that stung the face like bullets. Henri was glad to shield his head from the cutting attack by holding his heavy cloak up before it. Ordinarily the walk at this hour would have been one of no small danger, but tonight even the dwellers in the criminal quarter were undesirous of plying their midnight trade by the river bank. The cousins had passed the dark cluster of buildings about the old Louvre before either spoke. At length, however, the Marquis broke silence. "Claude, you have passed a point in life today, I think." "With the 2 that I won from the king, Henri?" "Those and the gauntlet of Marie Anne." There was a little pause. Then Claude said, in a tone whose weary monotony indicated a subject so often thought of as to be trite even in expression, "Do you ever regret that and went the way of the other 2? Will she, do you think, finish as did poor little Pauline? Or will some other send her from her place as she did my brother's wife, Louise?" As Claude had hesitated over the questions, so was Henri long in making reply. "I do not allow myself, Claude, to wonder over might-have-beens. There is a fate upon our family, I think. But of the 3 of our women who have gone her way, Marie is the fittest of them all for her place. Little Pauline Félicite, we named her death, my God, I do not like to think of it. And poor, weak Louise, your brother loved her dearly, Claude. And he is dead, and she is making her long penance in that great tomb of the Ursulines. Hi-ho! Thank the good God, my cousin, that you have neither sister nor wife in this court of France. There is not one of them can withstand the great temptation. Our times were not made for the women we love." And for the rest of their walk both men thought upon these same last words, which, through Claude's head, at least, had begun to ring like a dark refrain of prophecy, of warning. Our times were not made for the women we love. It was half an hour past midnight when the Marquis pounded the knocker on the door of his hotel by the Seine. It was opened with unusual readiness by the liveried porter, who betrayed some surprise at sight of those who waited to enter. "Oh, my lord is not at Versailles." "As you see, we are here," returned Henri, adding, "My apartment is ready?" "Certainly, Monsieur le Marquis' apartment is ready." "And one for Monsieur le Comte?" The servant bowed. "Light us up, then. Claude, will you have supper?" "No. Nothing more tonight." "Very well. Gallard, is Madame visible?" The porter coughed. "Madame la Marquise was at Madame de Tenson's till late. Madame, I think, is not visible." Mélisnesel shrugged his shoulders, and proceeded to the staircase. As the servant followed with a candelabrum, he made a curious, soft noise in his throat. Forthwith a footman glided swiftly into the hall from an antechamber, and took the other's place beside the door as if waiting for someone. Both nobles saw it. Neither spoke. 5 minutes later Claude was alone in his room. Henri had left him for the night, and he refused the services of a lackey in lieu of his own valet, who was at Versailles. The servant had lighted his candles, and a wood fire burned in the grate. His wet coat had been carried away to dry. His hat, surtout, and gloves lay upon a neighboring chair. Amid the lace of his jabot glittered the jeweled star which, 2 hours ago, had flashed upon the breast of the King of France. Claude seated himself, absently, in a chair beside the cheerily crackling fire, facing a great picture that hung upon the brocaded wall. It was Boucher's portrait of Marie and de Mélisnesel, Marquise de la Tournelle, Duchesse de Châteauroux. She looked down upon him now in that calmly superb manner which she had used only this morning, the manner that the court had raved over, that women vainly strove to imitate, that had conquered the indifference of a king. And as Claude de Mailly gazed, his own air, shamed perhaps by that of the woman, fell from him, as a sheet might fall from a statue. In one instant he was a different thing. He had become an individual, a man with a strong mentality of his own. The courtier's mask of imperturbable cynicism, the conventional domino of forced interest, the detestable undergarments of necessary toadyism, all were gone. Not the patch on his face, not the height of his heels, not the whiteness of his hands nor the breadth of his cuffs could make him now. Perhaps she whose painted likeness was before him would no more have cared to know him as he really was than she would have liked the words that he uttered, dreamily, before her picture. But it was the true Claude, Claude the man, nevertheless, who repeated aloud the thought in his heart. Our times are not made for the women we love.